June 10, 1944. Dawn came slow over Normandy, an ashen light that painted everything in the same shade of exhausted gray. Fog rolled across the hedgerows like smoke from an invisible fire, muffling the sound of engines warming on the makeshift airfield near Corentin. Rows of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts waited on the pierced steel runway, canopies beaded with dew, wings trembling in the morning chill. The smell of fuel and damp earth filled the air. Somewhere, a mechanic cursed the stiffness of a hydraulic line. Somewhere else, a chaplain walked the line in silence, murmuring half-remembered blessings to young men who didn't ask for them. Captain Harold Hal Kessler stood by his aircraft, serial 420315, codenamed Bell's Reprieve, and stared at the sheet of fog stretching east toward Cannes. He ran his fingers along the rivets of the left wing, tracing every groove like a man reading Braille. He didn't trust words anymore, only the feel of metal and the math of mechanics. Behind him, a ground crewman shouted something about fuel pressure, but Kessler didn't answer. He had already checked it twice. He always did. The mission board inside the tent had been updated an hour earlier. Objective: interdict German supply columns near Cannes. Altitude low. Weather variable. Resistance heavy flak expected. The orders were printed clean, official, detached from the smell of death that usually followed such missions. To headquarters, it was just another sortie. To the pilots, it was a lottery ticket with odds nobody liked. Inside the ready tent, the chatter was minimal. Cigarettes burned faster than words. Someone laughed about how the French cows didn't care who won the war. Lieutenant Sykes, the youngest in the squadron, asked if anyone had heard that the Luftwaffe was pulling back toward Paris. Kessler didn't join in. He adjusted his gloves, checked his flight chart, and studied the terrain sketches drawn from reconnaissance photos. The German anti-aircraft positions didn't make sense. Too organized, too precise. The spacing between batteries suggested foreknowledge, almost as if they knew exactly where the Thunderbolts would fly. When the squadron commander, Major Harlow, entered the tent, the conversations snapped silent. He looked tired, the kind of tired that came from reading casualty lists before sunrise. "Same as yesterday," he said. "Same roads, same targets. Keep formation tight. Radio silence until visual confirmation. No hero stuff." His eyes passed over Kessler briefly, perhaps remembering the report from April. Training incident, probable pilot error, aircraft destroyed, pilot survived. The words had followed Kessler ever since. He walked back to his plane as engines coughed to life. Each rotation of the propellers cut through the mist, turning it into white ribbons. The ground crew cleared the chocks, and the smell of burned aviation fuel mixed with morning air. Kessler climbed into the cockpit, the metal seat cold through his flight suit. He checked the gauges. Manifold pressure steady, oil temp rising, hydraulic pressure just within range. His left flap indicator twitched once. Barely noticeable, a mechanical stutter, but he saw it. He always saw everything. He made a note on his kneeboard. Flap response slow. Recheck post-sortie. The radio crackled, thin and ghostly. Red 1 to all, check formation, check spacing. Kessler keyed his mic. 2. Ready? Static answered. Then silence. The takeoff sequence began. The first P-47 thundered down the strip, disappearing into fog. Then another and another. The runway trembled with their weight. When Kessler's turn came, he throttled forward, feeling the vibration climb through his spine. The tail lifted, the wheels left the earth, and for a brief second the world below blurred into an indistinct gray. He leveled at 200 feet, low enough to skim treetops, high enough to feel the wind's edge. They flew east in a loose V formation, visibility barely a mile. Below, France unfolded in fragments. Farm roofs, church spires, broken fields still scarred by artillery. From up here, war looked almost peaceful, like a photograph drained of sound. Then the first burst of flak shattered the illusion. Black puffs erupted near the lead aircraft, followed by a mechanical cough from Kessler's radio. "Contact! 2 o'clock low!" Someone shouted. But the words came through fractured, distorted by interference. Another voice overlapped, foreign, clipped, then gone. Kessler's eyes narrowed. He adjusted his trim and studied the smoke patterns. German 88s didn't usually fire in symmetrical intervals, but these bursts came in timed pairs. Precise, mathematical, deliberate. It wasn't random defense fire. It was a trap. He toggled frequencies. The radio hissed back at him, spitting broken fragments of code and what sounded like Morse, faint and misplaced, as if someone were tapping from underwater. It wasn't any Allied signal he recognized. Then it stopped altogether. Command was gone. The sky ahead turned white with fog and black with flak. He looked down at his wing gauges again. Left flap indicator, flickering. The hydraulic needle quivered, then steadied. His breath fogged the canopy. He could barely see the next plane in formation, just a shadow moving through clouds. Every instinct told him to stay on course, hold altitude, follow orders. But the geometry in his head, the trajectory of the flak bursts, the distances between detonations told another story. The Germans had triangulated their position. If they stayed level another 30 seconds, they'd be slaughtered. He glanced at the manual override lever between his knees. The red tag read, "Do not engage in flight." Regulations were clear. The flap hydraulics on the P-47 were known to lock under asymmetric pressure, and manual deployment could flip the aircraft. The manual override existed only for ground maintenance. No sane pilot touched it in the air. But Kessler had once designed similar systems. He knew the pressure ratings, the fault tolerances, the failure patterns, and he knew the subtle hesitation in his left flap wasn't electrical. It was mechanical. A jam. One that could, in theory, be broken loose with enough torque differential. In theory. He stared at the lever and heard Major Harlow's briefing echo in his mind. No hero stuff. Below, tracer fire climbed the fog like burning ropes. The first burst tore through the wing of the plane ahead. It disintegrated silently in the distance, a dark flower blooming in the mist. Another burst rocked Kessler's Thunderbolt. The cockpit shuddered, instruments rattling against their mounts. He could smell hydraulic fluid, sharp and metallic. The left indicator dropped to 0. He had lost half his control authority. His breathing slowed. Training manuals, equations, the physics of airflow, all of it converged in that instant. He pictured the force vectors. If he could deploy only one flap partially, he might induce drag on one side and yaw the plane into a roll. Dangerous. But if timed with a dive, it could break the formation pattern, throw off the enemy's aim. If it failed, he'd simply spiral into the ground. He looked left and saw the shadow of Lieutenant Sykes' Thunderbolt holding formation, trusting him. Kessler hesitated a fraction longer, then wrapped his gloved hand around the red lever. The lever resisted. For a moment it felt frozen, welded to the console. He pulled harder. Something inside the wing groaned like a dying animal. The indicator needle jumped once. The aircraft lurched. Through the canopy he saw the world tilt 90 degrees. The horizon vanished, replaced by spinning fog and tracer fire slicing past the glass. His stomach pressed against the seatbelts as gravity shifted. Instruments blurred. The altimeter unwound like a clock losing its spring. He pushed throttle and rudder together, riding the torque. The radio came alive for a heartbeat. Red 2. What the hell are you? Then cut off. Outside, flak detonations missed their mark. The German gunners overshot, their calibrated rhythm broken. Kessler's unplanned roll carried him under the burst zone, and as he leveled out, the rest of the squadron, seeing his dive, followed instinctively. The formation split into chaotic vectors, scattering just as the next salvo filled the air they'd occupied seconds before. He couldn't tell whether the flap had retracted or simply jammed in place. The control stick trembled under his grip, and the warning light blinked uselessly. But somehow, improbably, the plane held. He leveled at treetop height and turned west, smoke trailing behind. Behind him, the radio static softened. A faint voice crackled through the noise, American but distant. All units clear. Repeat, clear. Then only wind. When they landed back at Corentin, the ground crew gathered silently around Bell's reprieve. Hydraulic fluid dripped from the left wing like blood. The actuator arm was twisted out of alignment, locked solid in partial deployment. By every known standard, it should have sheared off mid-air. Yet it hadn't. The flap had moved when it should not have, and then refused to move again. Kessler climbed down without a word. His boots touched the steel planking, and he looked at the sky still heavy with fog. The other planes were landing one by one, scarred, scorched, but alive. He removed his gloves slowly and placed them on the wing, staring at the jammed mechanism that had decided, for one unexplainable reason, to obey him. Hours later, as the official report was typed up, a clerk paused over a single line. Pilot claims manual flap actuation mid-flight. Physically impossible. He struck through the sentence and replaced it with equipment malfunction. Unconfirmed. And in a locked drawer marked 362nd Fighter Group, Incident C-10, the paper slept for decades. The days after the consortie passed like a fever dream. Quiet skies that felt heavier than gunfire. Captain Harold Kessler flew 2 more missions, both routine, both uneventful. Yet the silence between each takeoff began to gnaw at him. Something had shifted. Men who once joked with him at breakfast now spoke in lower tones. Major Harlow's glances lingered longer. The mechanics who once trusted his technical precision now avoided meeting his eyes, as if the impossible might be contagious. The story had spread fast. Kessler had pulled a lever that shouldn't have moved and lived to tell it. The rest of the squadron called it luck. Kessler called it math. Headquarters called it classified. He spent his evenings in the maintenance tent, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in the hydraulic guts of the P-47. The smell of oil clung to him like guilt. Every night he inspected the same flap actuator, searching for a rational explanation. A bent pin, a deformed piston, any proof that the plane's strange obedience had been mechanical, not miraculous. He found none. The metal was flawless, unmarred, as if it had simply chosen to work once and then forgotten how. Outside the tent, Normandy's airfields pulsed with life. Convoys unloading supplies, medics tending to burns, the distant thunder of artillery crawling inland. War, in its mechanical rhythm, didn't pause to question anomalies. But Kessler couldn't stop replaying the moment. The lever's resistance, the sudden torque, the eerie grace of a machine saving itself. It had felt less like control and more like surrender. Major Harlow summoned him to the command trailer on the 3rd night. The interior was cramped, lit by a single hanging bulb that swayed with every footstep. Harlow sat behind a folding desk covered with after-action reports. His tone was measured, but his eyes betrayed irritation. "Hal, you've got the highest survival record in this outfit. I respect that. But that thing you pulled out there, it's got people spooked. The brass says it defied operating limits. They don't like unexplained things." Kessler stood at attention. "With respect, sir, the flap was already compromised. I applied a manual override to stabilize roll authority. The control surfaces responded." Responded? Harlow's brows knit. "That's not what the mechanics say. They say the hydraulic system was bone dry. You can't move that flap manually in flight, not with a full load." "You're telling me it did anyway?" Kessler hesitated. "Yes, sir." Harlow exhaled through his nose. "Then either you're lying or we're flying ghosts. I can't report either. For now, it's written as a system malfunction." "Understood. Understood." Harlow leaned back in his chair, voice softening. "You did save 12 men that day. But sometimes, Hal, saving men isn't what command wants written down. They want consistent machines, not miracles." Kessler saluted and left. The words echoed in his head all night. They want consistent machines, not miracles. The next morning, fog rolled in again from the coast, thicker than before. Visibility was under a mile. Flight operations delayed. Kessler used the downtime to walk the perimeter road, the world muted except for distant truck engines and crows. His boots left shallow prints in the mud. He found himself drawn to the wreckage pile behind the hangars. A graveyard of twisted wings and shattered propellers, all tagged with serial numbers. Each one represented a decision, a failed calculation, a man erased. He touched the nose cone of a burnt-out Thunderbolt and thought of equations. Lift, drag, thrust, weight, and how none accounted for chance. A mechanic named O'Donnell approached, cigarette hanging from his lip. "You're looking for ghosts, Captain?" "Just answers," Kessler replied. O'Donnell exhaled smoke. "That flap of yours, we stripped it twice. It's clean. Like it never jammed in the first place. Maybe it just wanted to help." He grinned, half joking, but his eyes flicked with unease. "Machines don't want anything," Kessler said. "Maybe not. But sometimes they know things before we do." That night, the squadron mess was unusually quiet. Men drank coffee in silence, the radio tuned to BBC static. Reports of heavy German counterattacks near Villers-Bocage filtered through. Tigers smashing through British lines, entire columns wiped out. The war was far from over, and everyone knew the next mission could be worse. Lieutenant Sykes sat across from Kessler, eyes hollow. "You know, they're saying that maneuver you did wasn't physics. Some guys think you blacked out, that the plane just corrected itself. Like it's one of those stories. Pilot unconscious, plane lands anyway." Kessler looked up. "I didn't black out." Sykes shrugged. "Maybe that's worse." The next day, command ordered them to reconnoiter the same sector, Ken again. Kessler's stomach tightened at the briefing. Same fog, same roads, same invisible guns waiting below. He checked his aircraft obsessively before takeoff, but everything looked normal. Too normal. As he ran pre-flight checks, the radio sputtered with faint interference again, a rhythmic clicking buried in static. Not Morse. Not random either. He leaned closer to the receiver. It repeated in intervals. Short, short, long, short, long, short. Then silence. When he looked up, the tower lights flickered. A ground crewman waved impatiently for him to taxi. The flight took off at 0700. The sky looked like it had been erased by chalk dust. Within minutes, they were flying through total whiteness. The only reference points were shadows of wings and the flicker of propeller arcs. Kessler's instruments vibrated faintly. Oil pressure steady. Hydraulics nominal. But his mind wasn't. He thought about that signal, those rhythmic clicks. The pattern nagged at him. He'd studied acoustics once. He knew the sound of electrical feedback from loose shielding. But this had rhythm, intent, something deliberate. It reminded him of something from his pre-war engineering lab, a test signal used to synchronize servo calibrations. It meant alignment, correction. Below them, flak bursts began again, soft at first, then hammering in waves. The squadron dipped lower, trusting their leader's voice cutting through radio noise. "Red flight, descend 200, break north on mark." Then the static swallowed the command hole. The next moment was chaos, black smoke and tracer streaks arcing from unseen guns. Kessler felt the same crawling instinct as before. The pattern, the geometry. German gunners had learned from last time. They weren't firing at coordinates. They were predicting evasive vectors. Each round bracketed the airspace like invisible jaws. He felt the lever under his hand again, the same red tag catching the corner of his vision. The manuals flashed through his mind. He knew he couldn't rely on miracles twice. Yet the squadron was flying blind, waiting for an order that wouldn't come. Through the haze, a flare burst ahead. A signal from Major Harlow's plane. The meaning was clear: maintain formation. But something inside Kessler hesitated. He trusted math more than hierarchy. He reduced throttle slightly, letting his aircraft drift a fraction out of alignment, studying the flak bursts. They adjusted instantly. The Germans were tracking formation center. His voice cut through the radio. "All units, break formation on my mark. Disperse west by south." Static. No acknowledgement. Then Sykes's voice. "You're not red leader, Hal. Do it now," Kessler said quietly. "Or we're already dead." He banked hard left. 2 planes followed. The others hesitated, then scattered as new flak erupted where they'd been seconds earlier. The shock wave shuddered through the air, rattling his canopy. For several minutes, the sky dissolved into chaos. Thunderbolts twisting through smoke, each pilot alone, acting on instinct. When they finally regrouped miles away, all 12 aircraft were still flying. No casualties, no explanation, Back on the ground, the briefing was terse. Major Harlow cornered Kessler outside the tent. You broke formation under radio silence. You realize that's a court-martial offense. I reacted to changing data, Kessler replied evenly. Data? Harlow barked. You're not in a lab, Captain. You're in a war. Kessler didn't flinch. War doesn't cancel physics, sir. Harlow stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. You've got good instincts. Maybe too good. Command's grounding you until they figure out what the hell you're doing up there. He walked away, leaving Kessler alone in the fading light. The airfield smelled of burnt fuel and grass. The horizon flickered with distant gunfire. Kessler sat on the wing of Bell's Reprieve, staring at his hands. Steady, unshaken, yet somehow foreign. That night he heard the clicking again. From the radio in his quarters this time. The same pattern, short, long, short. He scribbled it onto paper, cross-referenced it against signal charts, and found nothing. But in the middle of the night, a realization came, cold and precise. It wasn't a transmission. It was an echo, a feedback loop. His own flap actuator's test tone, somehow recorded and bouncing back through allied frequencies. He didn't sleep after that. By dawn, word came down. His aircraft was being reassigned for systems evaluation. He wouldn't fly again until further notice. But in his chest, he felt the same unease he'd known in the cockpit, that the machine hadn't finished speaking. Outside, engines roared as the squadron prepared another mission without him. Kessler watched them vanish into the fog, one by one, and wondered if they understood how thin the line was between obedience and oblivion. He turned back to the hangar where Bell's Reprieve rested under canvas, the flap actuator gleaming faintly in the half-light. He laid his hand on the metal and whispered, almost to himself, "We're not done yet." The machine, as always, said nothing. But for a fleeting second, the radio on his desk clicked once, short, long, and then went still. The morning of June 15th broke with a wind that smelled of iron and seaweed, carrying the faint rumble of artillery from inland France. Clouds hung low, thick and yellow-gray, the kind that seemed to press down on the earth itself. Captain Harold Kessler woke before dawn, long before the base loudspeakers called reveille. He hadn't slept properly in days. The sound of that coded clicking short, long, still echoed in his skull like a clock counting down. His aircraft, Bell's Reprieve, was officially grounded pending inspection. He had been ordered to remain off flight status until command concluded its evaluation. But orders in war, he'd learned, had a strange way of bending under the weight of necessity. The squadron briefing that morning was abrupt. The Germans were regrouping west of Cannes. Convoy traffic had resumed under heavy camouflage, and Allied armor needed immediate air cover. Major Harlow announced a 12-plane strike package, same sector, same low altitude. Kessler listened from the doorway, standing just outside the tent like a ghost. He wasn't on the flight list. His name was missing, redacted by silence. After the briefing, Harlow approached him, helmet in hand, eyes tired. "You're benched, Hell. Direct order from Group Command. You're too valuable to lose to another malfunction." Kessler nodded, though something cold tightened in his chest. If those hydraulics were faulty, they should ground the aircraft, not the pilot. Harlow sighed. "They're not grounding the plane, they're studying it. Don't make this harder. You've done enough." Kessler didn't answer. Outside, he watched the crews ready the Thunderbolts. Refueling, rearming, shouting over engines. Men he'd flown with for months moved like clockwork, trusting procedures he no longer trusted himself. In the hangar, Bell's Reprieve sat alone under tarps, its fuselage streaked with oil and fingerprints. He walked around it slowly, hand brushing the cowling. A maintenance officer spotted him and frowned. "Sir, that one's under evaluation. Orders say no access." "I know," Kessler said quietly. "Just one last check." The officer hesitated, then shrugged. "Make it quick. They'll be rolling in 10. Kessler climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. Everything was the same. The smell of oil, the faint vibration of the instrument panel, the small nick on the throttle knob. He powered the radio, and for a moment all was static. Then there it was again, that faint pattern, low and pulsing through the headset. Short, short, long. Short, long, short. A mechanical whisper. He stared at the lever beside his knee. The red tag was frayed at the corner. The warning letters faded by use. The manual override. The forbidden act that had saved them once. He had studied the hydraulic schematics enough to know the risk. It wasn't just about pressure failure. If the manual bypass engaged while the pump was active, it could rupture the line entirely. Instant loss of control. Catastrophic failure. He looked out across the field. The other pilots were taxiing now, engines snarling against the wind. 12 silver-gray shapes rolling into formation, their exhaust leaving ribbons of smoke that dissolved into fog. He felt something tug inside him, a mix of instinct, dread, and unfinished geometry. He unbuckled the tarp from his canopy, flipped the main ignition, and the P-47 roared to life. The maintenance officer turned, shouting, but his words were drowned by the engine's thunder. Kessler advanced the throttle, released the brakes, and the aircraft began to roll. Behind him, a crewman waved wildly, but Kessler kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. The tower barked in his headset, "Unscheduled departure. Identify immediately." He didn't reply. The Thunderbolt gathered speed, heavy and sure, lifting into the gray void like a blade through smoke. At 1,500 feet, the radio came alive with chatter. "Red Squadron, form up. Check altitude. 1,000 low." He slipped into formation from the rear before anyone recognized his voice. 2-7 in position, he said calmly, using a call sign that hadn't been assigned to him since the first week of June. For a brief moment, silence. Then Major Harlow's voice broke in, sharp and incredulous. "Kessler? What the hell are you doing up here?" "Flying, sir," he said. "You'll need every gun in the air today." Kessler turned back. "That's an order." But he was already diving through cloud, eyes scanning the patchwork of fields below. The German convoy stretched across a narrow dirt road east of Cannes. Dozens of trucks, half-tracks, and an 88 battery concealed under camouflage nets. Flak began to bloom before the squadron even aligned for attack. Tracer fire climbed into the mist, luminous ropes crossing the sky. Kessler's mind measured every burst. The rhythm, the spacing, the mathematics of death. They were being guided just like before. He saw the same pattern in the sky, the same calculated trap closing in. "Flak is coordinated," he shouted. "They're drawing you in. Break the approach vector now." Harlow's voice came back strained. "Negative. We've got ground confirmation. Stay on target." The air filled with black explosions. 2 thunderbolts vanished in smoke, wings torn apart. The rest scattered instinctively. Kessler banked left, descending through debris, heart pounding in a rhythm that matched the clicking in his headset. Short, short, long. The left wing trembled, hydraulic warning light flickering. The flap indicator dipped erratically. He knew what that meant. The jam was back. The same cursed flaw. Only this time there would be no surprise miracle, no chance alignment. He would have to make it happen himself. He leveled the plane at 600 feet, the roar of the engine deafening inside the canopy. "Red flight, follow my vector. Southwest roll pattern, offset dive." "Negative," Harlow barked again. "Stay on the target." But Kessler was already moving. He pulled the override lever halfway. Resistance. He pressed harder, the metal biting through his glove. A tremor shook the fuselage. The flap twitched barely an inch. Enough. He pushed the nose down, diving straight into the wall of flak. The sky erupted around him. Smoke and light swallowed everything. For one horrifying second, he felt the plane slip sideways, control vanishing as the flap locked into asymmetry. Then the torque caught, the right wing dipped, the aircraft rolled under the tracer streams, and the world inverted. The German guns misfired, their timing broken by his unpredictable dive. Kessler squeezed the trigger, releasing 8.50 caliber guns in a single sweeping burst. The convoy below exploded into chaos. Trucks bursting like tin cans, ammunition cooking off in white fire. He leveled just above the treetops, breath ragged. The flap light flashed red, locked again. But the squadron was still in the air, breaking free of the kill zone. Voices screamed through the radio. "Whoever did that dive, you saved our hides." But Kessler couldn't answer. The controls were sluggish, heavy. He checked altitude, barely 400 feet. The hydraulic pressure gauge dropped to 0. He'd lost the system entirely. Fuel pressure followed. Then the oil temp climbed. The aircraft was bleeding out. "Mayday," he whispered. "Manual control lost. Going down south of Cannes." Harlow's voice cracked through static. "Bail out, hell. You're too low." He looked at the fields below, rows of hedgerows, a narrow river glinting like steel. Too low to jump, too fast to land. He reduced throttle, fighting the stick. The left wing bucked violently. Then something strange happened. The same clicking returned, loud now, echoing through the cockpit speakers. Short, short, long, short, long, short. The flap actuator, dying, was signaling itself. The stick lightened. Control returned, not much, but enough. Kessler guided the crippled plane toward a small clearing between trees. The landing was brutal, metal shrieking, earth erupting. The P-47 plowed through grass, snapped a fence, and came to rest nose down in mud. Smoke filled the cockpit, acrid and sweet. He unlatched the canopy and pulled himself out, collapsing onto wet soil. His ears rang. The plane hissed beside him, steam rising from its broken engine. For a moment he just lay there, breathing, watching crows circle above. In the distance, he heard the fading hum of the squadron heading west. Alive. All 12 had made it back. He laughed once, a dry, disbelieving sound. Then the laughter died. German voices echoed faintly through the hedgerows. "Patrol." He ducked behind the wreckage, pistol drawn, heart hammering. But the soldiers never came closer. They were shouting, pointing skyward, terrified. He looked up and saw 3 more thunderbolts descending, strafing the road where the convoy had regrouped. His maneuver had given them coordinates, timing, survival. The patrol scattered under the bombardment. Dirt rained over him. When silence returned, only the wrecked plane and its pilot remained. Kessler dragged himself back to the fuselage. The left flap was locked halfway open, twisted but still attached. He touched it, fingers trembling. Beneath the mud and oil, the actuator casing had split slightly, exposing the valve assembly. Inside, he saw something that made no sense, a secondary bypass line not in any schematic he'd ever studied. An experimental modification, one that shouldn't exist. He stared at it until the sound of approaching Allied jeeps reached him from the west. When the recovery team found him, he refused medical evacuation until they retrieved the actuator. He insisted it was evidence. The engineers who later examined it were baffled. "This configuration doesn't match any production model," one said. "Looks like a prototype." Back at base, Kessler sat on a stretcher, uniform torn, mud drying on his face. Major Harlow crouched beside him. "You disobeyed again," he said quietly. "And you saved every man I've got." Kessler met his eyes. It wasn't disobedience. It was physics. Harlow looked at the wrecked flap assembly on the ground, its twisted lines glinting in the fading light. Whatever it was, Command's not going to believe it. "They don't have to," Kessler replied. That night, the wreckage of Bell's Reprieve was hauled away under canvas. The official report labeled the incident equipment malfunction resulting in forced landing. No mention of the maneuver. No mention of the flaw. The hydraulic actuator disappeared into the logistics chain, sent for analysis, and was never seen again. But pilots whispered about it afterward. The maneuver no one could explain. The dive that broke the ambush. Some called it luck. Some called it divine. Kessler never corrected them. He just said it was the flap that shouldn't have worked, and did. The next morning, he was reassigned to technical advisory duty. His combat record remained unremarkable. a line of numbers without a story. And yet, somewhere over Normandy, there were 12 men who owed their lives to an act that every manual said was impossible. 40 years later, the sound of rain on metal roofs was all that remained of the old airfield near Corentin. The French farmers who tended the land now plowed over what had once been taxiways. The control tower, rebuilt into a storage shed, still carried the faint outline of painted numbers on its cracked concrete. It was there, in the winter of 1987, that an American historian named Robert Langley arrived with a camera, a stack of declassified maintenance logs, and a single question. How did Captain Harold Kessler's Thunderbolt survive a hydraulic failure that should have killed him? Langley had served as an aviation engineer during Korea, and his fascination with oddities, the files marked anomalous incident, had led him to dusty archives and forgotten depots across Europe. The Kessler file had surfaced accidentally in a transfer list marked restricted, Hydraulic Research Batch 7. Inside was a single report, Incident C10, June 1944. Attached were 2 photographs, one of a wrecked P-47 half-buried in mud, and one of a close-up valve assembly labeled Bendix Prototype Hydraulic Bypass. No production record matched it. The notation in pencil at the bottom of the page read, Pilot claims partial manual actuation. Investigation deferred. File closed 7/44. Langley spent months piecing together fragments, letters from surviving 362nd pilots, maintenance rosters, scattered field notes from Lockheed subcontractors. The more he uncovered, the stranger it became. The serial number of Bell's Reprieve matched a shipment of 12 experimental aircraft modified under a stateside test program called Project Alden, designed to evaluate variable resistance control systems. The project had officially been canceled in 1943 due to unstable feedback response. Yet somehow one of those prototypes had reached the front lines. He found Kessler's last known address in Oregon, a small town called Bend, near pine-covered hills. The pilot had retired as a mechanical surveyor, never applying for veteran benefits, never writing a memoir, never mentioning the war. Langley mailed a letter requesting an interview. A month passed with no reply. Then, one evening, his phone rang. The voice was calm, dry, and aged. "You're the one asking about the wing flap." "Yes, sir. Captain Kessler." A pause, then a faint chuckle. "I haven't been called that in decades. But yes, you found the file then." Langley explained what he'd discovered, the declassified logs, the missing actuator, the experimental linkage. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. Finally, Kessler said, "Come by tomorrow. Morning's best. I'm easier to find in the daylight." The next day, Langley drove through misty forest roads until he reached a small house perched above a river. Kessler answered the door in a wool sweater, stooped but alert, his eyes clear and precise. They sat by the window overlooking pine trees while the rain softened into drizzle. On the table between them lay the faded photograph of Bell's Reprieve. "You know," Kessler began, "I didn't think anyone would ever come asking about that day. I thought the report had been buried for good." Langley leaned forward. "It almost was. But that flap, whatever happened with it, it shouldn't have moved. Not without full pressure." Kessler smiled faintly. "That's what the manual said." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small metal object wrapped in cloth. When he unrolled it, Langley saw a bent brass cylinder with a valve stem protruding from one end. It was the actuator. "I kept this," Kessler said quietly. "Took it from the wreck before they hauled the plane away. Figured they'd lose it anyway." Langley examined the part carefully. The metal was scarred and warped, but the engraving Bendix R&D Type 7B prototype was still visible. "You knew it wasn't standard issue," Langley said. "I suspected," Kessler replied. "The torque feedback was different, smoother. When I pulled that lever, it didn't feel like resistance. Felt like negotiation." "Negotiation." Kessler looked out the window, eyes distant. "A machine has limits, but those limits aren't moral. They just exist. That day something gave: pressure, alignment, luck, maybe all three. I didn't think I was breaking rules. I was listening." Langley hesitated. Command called it impossible. They said the actuator couldn't respond. Kessler nodded slowly. That's because they never built it to respond. That bypass wasn't for flight control, it was for testing torque feedback. A failsafe they forgot to remove. When the hydraulics failed, it vented just enough pressure to free one flap. That's all it took. He fell silent for a moment, then added, I didn't tell anyone. They would have grounded the entire fleet over a design flaw. We needed those planes flying. So I let them write it up as malfunction. Langley studied him carefully. You saved 12 pilots that day. Kessler's mouth tightened. Maybe. Or maybe I just didn't want to die repeating a mistake I understood too well. The war didn't reward curiosity, Mr. Langley. It punished it. They talked for hours about engineering, duty, silence. Kessler spoke without pride, only precision, as if recounting an equation whose answer no one else had solved. When the rain stopped, he stood and walked to a cabinet. Inside were dozens of notebooks filled with sketches, valves, flap linkages, hydraulic schematics. I kept working on the idea, he said, not for fame, just to understand why the metal moved that day. Langley asked if he'd ever told anyone else. Once, Kessler said. Major Harlow wrote me a letter in '46. Said the maneuver I pulled was being studied at Wright Field. Called it the Kessler roll. They renamed it later, Evasive Dive Recovery Technique. I never corrected them. The manuals never mention the flap. That night, Langley stayed at a nearby inn and read through the notes Kessler had lent him. Among the sketches, he found one page marked simply June 10, 1944, data unknown. Beneath it, a line written in careful script. The machine heard me once. I hope it never had to again. Weeks later, Langley published an article in the American Aviation Review titled The Normandy Flap Anomaly, a forgotten case of wartime innovation. He described how early P-47 models may have included unrecorded bypass valves that allowed limited manual actuation under hydraulic stress. He mentioned Captain Kessler by name only once, in passing, calling him a pilot whose intuition bridged the line between engineer and survivor. The article sparked modest interest among historians, but what caught the Air Force's attention was the recovered actuator. Within months, Langley received a formal request to surrender it for examination. The letter was polite but firm. When he called Kessler to tell him, the old pilot only chuckled. They can have it, he said. The secret's not in the metal. It's in the silence. Kessler died quietly a year later. His obituary listed him simply as a retired engineer, husband, father of 2, veteran of the U.S. Army Air Forces. There was no mention of Can, of the flap, or of 12 men who owed their lives to a decision never written down. But at his funeral, one of those men was there, Lieutenant Sykes, gray-haired and walking with a cane. After the ceremony, he approached Langley, who had come to pay his respects. "You're the historian," Sykes said softly. "You wrote about hell." "Yes," Langley replied. "I wanted people to know the truth." Sykes looked toward the casket. "He never talked about it. But every time I flew after that war, I remembered that roll, how the world turned upside down and somehow made sense. We thought it was madness. Turns out it was math." He paused, eyes wet. "The funny thing is, the Air Force taught that maneuver for years without knowing where it came from. They called it a contingency pattern. Every cadet learned it. Every one of them owes him something, even if they'll never know his name." Years passed. Langley's article faded into academic obscurity, referenced occasionally in niche aviation forums. But in 2003, when the Smithsonian restored a P-47 Thunderbolt for display, one curator stumbled upon a curious entry in a wartime maintenance manual. In the margin beside a diagram of the hydraulic system, someone had written in pencil, "In emergency descent, left flap drag differential may aid roll recovery. See C10 file." The curator searched for C10, but found no record. When Langley was contacted for comment, he only said, "The man who knew is gone. The rest is just interpretation." On a rainy afternoon years later, visitors to the Air and Space Museum passed beneath the restored Thunderbolt. Few noticed the small placard at the base of the display. Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, Normandy, June 1944. This aircraft model contributed to critical air support during the Battle of Cannes. An unverified field report from that campaign describes an unauthorized control override, credited with saving multiple pilots. The incident remains unexplained. Beneath it, in smaller letters, almost as an afterthought, sometimes, salvation is the byproduct of disobedience guided by conscience. That line was Langley's doing. He'd borrowed it from something Kessler once said before he died. Words spoken quietly as they looked out over the Oregon River. We think machines obey us, but they don't. They listen. And sometimes, when no one else does, they answer. In the end, that was how history remembered him. Not through medals or orders, but through a maneuver no one could replicate, through a mystery left unsolved yet deeply human. The classified file remained incomplete, the actuator lost again to bureaucracy, and the question lingered, suspended between physics and faith. And somewhere, in the static of an old recording preserved in Langley's archive, a faint sound still played, a sequence of mechanical clicks, short, long, short, like an echo from a machine that once broke its own rules to keep men alive. He didn't vanish. History just couldn't explain him.